thank you. It's really nice to be home, back in my old hometown. Would like to thank the library people here for having me back. And I did spend some time here. Now, I have to be honest, the queue is, I don't know if it's still here, but over on Central Avenue, we used to tell Mom and Dad we were going to the library and then go over there and shoot pool. So, but we did make it to the library a few times. And what a fantastic facility. For those of you who love architecture and books, what better combination could you have than the Carnegie-Stout library right here. So, and thanks to each of you for coming out. I was watching the weather for about 2 weeks out, and it said 5 degrees and possibly snow, and I thought, oh boy. But we'll take tonight, and thank you so much for being here. As the title suggests, Dubuque has something to do with the book. And Dubuque is, in some ways, I spent a great deal of time today driving around, looking at some of the old sites. And it looked, pretty much like it was when I was here a few years back, but it looks different as well. And one of the main differences is the makeup of the population here. When I was in high school, at Dubuque Senior, it was a 3-year high school at the time, we had 2,000 students. In that entire high school, there were 5 students of color. There was Jordan Smith, who I talk about in the book, and his sisters. There was a foreign exchange student from Ethiopia, and there was a foreign exchange student from India. That was it. The rest of the folks there looked pretty much like me. And so my opportunities to interact with people of different cultures was very, very limited. I did have the opportunity to be involved in athletics. And for some of you in the room, I think you remember the old Mississippi Valley Athletic Conference. One of the best high school conferences, I think, perhaps ever created. So the guys from Dubuque would go down and play teams from Moline, Rock Island, East Moline. We'd travel over to Cedar Rapids, down to Iowa City, Clinton. And so I got an opportunity to at least see people that look different than I. And when you're out there competing, you don't have a lot of time to interview each other. So my interactions were very, very limited. So I'm going to, with your indulgence tonight, take you through a little bit of the development of the book, give you a few passages, and then certainly open it up for questions, which for me is my favorite part, because I get to hear from you, and it always broadens my perspective. As the title indicates, it's a journey. It's a lifelong journey. Someone said, Dave, how long are you going to do this? And I said, probably till I'm not doing anything. So it is a commitment for the rest of my life. So hopefully I'll master the technology, or at least be able to move through it so we can have a coherent evening together. One of the questions that comes up early on is, did you intend to write a book about racism? The short answer is no. And several times during this experience, over about 6 years, things happen serendipitously, whether it's divine intervention, just plain luck, I'm not sure. But I was at home one evening, scanning the channels, looking for something to watch, and it was a rebroadcast of the January 12th episode of David Letterman's the first episode of his new show, My Next Guest, There Is No Introduction. I was actually watching it in mid-November, and that first guest was Barack Obama. And I remember then Senator Obama back in the early 2000s as an Illinois senator. And then he came to the Democratic National Convention in 2004. And if any of you saw and remember that speech, it was spellbinding. I thought, this guy, we should keep an eye on him. Certainly 3 years later, he was elected president. So that was very interesting. And of course, Letterman with his style and President Obama with his intellect and wit, it was very entertaining. But there was a smaller part of that, and they referenced when President Obama had gone to the 50th anniversary of the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. The part that drew me in was Congressman John Lewis, and they talked about him as one of the leaders of that nonviolent, passive across the bridge first attempt. It actually took 3 attempts in early March of 1965 to finally get across the bridge as they protested voting rights and got to the capital of Montgomery, about 54 miles away. Part of the program, the Letterman program, was just Congressman Lewis and Letterman walking across that bridge and talking about the congressman's recollection of what happened. So I watched that, and I'll share a little bit more about that, but I said to my partner, Sheila Lehman, I said, I'm going to Selma in a couple of weeks. Do you want to go? And she said yes. And that trip really, not to be overly dramatic, but it really changed my life in a number of ways. So off we went. We spent a couple days in Montgomery, which I would encourage you, if you want to do part of this trip, go to Montgomery first, go to the museums. Montgomery, the cradle of the Confederacy, and the birthplace of civil rights, all in the same city. And they have done a very good job of chronicling their history. They have not avoided what happened there. You can go to the slave markets and read about them and stand in the places where the slaves stood with livestock as they were auctioned off. All those kinds of things. And the museums there are certainly worth a look. So on March 5th, we assembled for the march. And if you recall the picture of me on the cover of the book, I was wearing a tie. And someone said, Dave, why do you wear a tie? I said, well, I was going to church. Well, I would have had to get there about 3 or 4 hours before the actual event started because you couldn't get everybody in the church. Now, fortunately, they had big screens outside. They pumped the sound out so we could keep up with what was going on in Brown Chapel African American Episcopal Church. But it was really interesting just to kind of mill about with the folks that were there. So after listening to the speakers, we started our march down toward the bridge. Turns out there were 20,000 of us. It was the most uplifting, emotional event that I can remember. And I've had a few of those with the birth of my children and athletic events and, big things. This was one of those days that is just a memorable experience. No matter which way I turn, left, right, back, forward, having conversations with folks as we marched to the bridge. Sheila said, hey, let me take a picture. And again, having no idea that a book would be forthcoming. And when we got to the publishers, they said, we think we can do something with this picture. And so you just never know, another bit of serendipity along the way. So as we continued our march, we knew what was waiting on the other side for John Lewis and the others that initial time, because we had done a little research. And here's what it looked like. There were hundreds of state troopers, local police, armed, tear gas, some were mounted on horses. I've seen the video of this, and I would encourage you to Google it. I don't have rights to show that video, but you can get it online. It is amazing. These folks coming peacefully across the bridge, there were about 300, I believe, of them are coming 2 by 2 across the bridge, and this mass of law enforcement overran them. Congressman Lewis almost lost his life that day. He was beaten with a nightstick, fractured his skull. They got him back to the church and got him the necessary attention that he needed. As we came across the bridge, you could just feel what was going on there. So one of the speakers prior to us marching said, when you go home, do something. Just don't go back and say, I went to Selma and I walked with a bunch of people and it was really a neat experience. So, excuse me, I'm going the wrong way here. Getting ahead of myself. So I shared this with my 2 older brothers. Now, those of you who have older siblings, they always have great ideas for you. So they said, Dave, you ought to write something. So I wrote a little essay and I put it on Facebook And I was living in Moline, Illinois at the time, and they put it in the Quad City papers. And I basically described what I have described to you. And I had the notion when I got home that we have really turned the corner on this racism thing in America. We are there. I mean, I was filled with these positive experiences. And here's another bit of serendipity. Now, these little numbers that come up, they remind Dave what page to look at, so I can read to you. But the final paragraph, here's what I said. Finally, as I sit here today, typing with feelings still very much alive and images vivid, I'm puzzled. Why, after all this time, and in this great country, is there still an Edmund Pettus Bridge and the need to cross it en masse every year? So for some reason, there was a grain of doubt that had been implanted in my brain. And I would like to say, and I should have said earlier, the Edmund Pettus Bridge is named for Edmund Pettus, who was a Confederate general during the Civil War. He became a senator from Mississippi, and he was a Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. Interestingly enough, that bridge was built in 1940, many, many years after the Civil War. Coincidentally, that was the same year that John Lewis was born. So coincidences in our history are pretty remarkable. So shortly after that, Sheila gave me this book called Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi. And I see some nods now and then. People have read it. It's a very, very powerful read. And it doesn't take too long to really get into it. So by page 3, I'm reading about Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis. If you recall, he became the president of the Confederacy, and he was speaking against funding for black education in Washington, D.C. on April 12th, 1860. That's exactly to the day, 1 year from when the Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter to begin the Civil War. Another one of those kind of coincidences. Davis went on to say, this government was not founded by Negroes, for Negroes, but by white men, for white men. And when I first read that, I thought, no, that's not right. Well, as I watched and read and got a little more in touch with the history of this country, you know, a lot of this has been intentional, it seems to me. And by the way, I want to preface my remarks tonight, and those that I've said and those that are coming. These are my views. Now, the book is very well researched. Some of you have read it and know that, you know, when you're dealing with any topic, you should tell people on what you're basing the things you're saying. So when I first looked at this, I thought, no, and then I thought, you know, historically that might be right. But here's where old Jeff and I really parted. The bill was based on the false notion of racial equality, stating further the inequality of white and black races was stamped from the beginning. By the time I had read this book, this part, and I had worked in diverse communities, I taught kids, met with their parents, coached kids, had fraternity brothers, people of color, socialized, been in homes, in my home. So I really took exception to this. And this was really kind of the thing that really lit my fire to get things going. So I began to reminisce, and the book is part memoir. So they're interspersed in there are some stories from childhood till the present, where I give my views and the interactions I had that have really made a difference for me. I think you'll find that it's heavily researched. I began to write, had a lot of false starts. And the key to the book, I think, are the interviews that are in there. And there are, I interviewed 35 different people. And Kim Swift is sitting right over here. And she was very much a key, particularly in Dubuque and early on, to the interviews that I was able to have here, including her own. I didn't know Kim at the time. I remember back in the early 90s, there were some things going on in Dubuque, and Kim and some other folks were invited to be on the Phil Donahue show. And there were some racist representatives of the city that were on the Donahue show as well. I had an old VHS recorder at the time. Actually, it was a new VHS recorder at the time. And recorded that session. When I heard Dubuque, I recorded it because it was taking place during the day and I was working. Well, I watched that recording, and so Kim Swift kind of stuck in my head. Years later, then, we get talking about this, and I looked all over the place, and I found the VHS. And I popped it in, and my children had recorded some Disney thing over it, so I couldn't capture it. So Kim led me to Dan Johnson, who's now the principal. He's a black man, now the principal at Ankeny, was a longtime counselor at Dubuque Senior High, the principal there. She said, why don't you talk to Jim Brady, the former mayor, who was very instrumental in starting to change the direction of Dubuque in the early 90s. Anthony Allen, president of the local NAACP branch, who really got my eyes opened in ways they hadn't been before, and Roy Buell. So who was the longest running mayor, and Roy was a year behind me, both at Jefferson and at Senior High. So those interviews really started to open my eyes, particularly the interviews with folks of color. And some of them I knew, not all of them. Well, I guess I didn't know I had this slide in here, so there you go. So those are the people. And then there were some people I didn't know. This is Dow Jock. And I'm thinking we might have some Iowa Hawkeye basketball fans among you tonight. I see some nods there. Dow Jock is the older brother of Peter Jock. And Peter played for the Iowa Hawkeyes, went on and had played a few years in the NBA. An exceptional player. I had read an article about Dow in the Des Moines Register. Did not know Dow at all. And I called him up where he was working. He was working in the Des Moines Public Schools at the time, and I said, hey, can we talk about racism? Now, this is some guy, he has no idea who I am. And he said, sure. We had about 3 hour-and-a-half, 2 hour sessions. An incredible guy. So here's a few things about Dow and the power of the interviews. Dow was born in Khartoum, Sudan. His father, a general of the People's Liberation Army, was killed during the Second Sudanese Civil War when Dow was 6 years old. Along with his mother and younger brother, he fled Sudan and made his way to America when he was 12 years old. He spoke no English. I'm going to repeat that. He spoke no English when he got here when he was 12 years old. Incredibly, just 6 years later, he graduated from prestigious Roosevelt High School in Des Moines, and then went on to earn a degree in philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, an Ivy League school, by the way, and a master's degree from the University of London. After completing his degrees, he enlisted in the United States Army. He was on active duty for a year in Iraq. Upon returning, he became the company commander of his Army Reserve Unit in Des Moines. He recently completed a doctorate in education from Drake University. Spoke no English when he got here when he was 12 years old. Served across the ocean in the military. So when I asked Dow, have you ever been profiled? And I'll stop here for a minute. That's one of the key questions I asked. And by that, I mean racial profiling based on the color of one's skin. I've been profiled a number of times. As I told you, I had two older brothers. They were both fantastic musicians. So when the third Markward boy came along, they were expecting another fantastic musician. I had been profiled. They were disappointed. I think I had other attributes. I was taking a nonverbal communication course, working on my master's degree years ago in the 70s. And think about this now, nonverbal communication. We had to come up with a project. I was in the National Guard at the time, so I had my dress green uniform. So I came up with this project, and one of my buddies got about a half a block behind me. And I put on my dress greens and I hitchhiked on 38th Avenue, or 38th Street, goes through from Rock Island where that is, a very busy street. And with my dress greens on, almost every car stopped. Back then I had the empirical data, I don't have it with me now. And then I went and changed, and I put a long black wig on, I put bell-bottom pants on, I put beads around my neck, I was a hippie. And almost no one stopped. So there are a lot of ways that people make snap judgments based on our appearances. When I talk to my friends that acquaintances that I was interviewing, we were talking about skin color. And it made all the difference in the world. I have never been profiled because of the color of my skin. One of my colleagues in Cedar Rapids said, when I asked him, have you ever been profiled? He said, Dr. Markward, I'm black. And it became so routine. It was everyone. So in summary, I'll let you scan this, but these are the descriptions of the people, their jobs, their walks in life that I interviewed and asked that question. It's a pretty impressive array of folks, right? Doesn't make any difference. Each of them has been profiled multiple times. And I keep thinking this has to start disappearing. There's a young guy named Stacy Walker, and Stacy was a high school student at Washington High School when I was superintendent of Cedar Rapids Schools, and I used to go watch him play football. Then I moved away from Cedar Rapids and came back, and Stacy was one of 3 county supervisors. Now, in Rock Island County, there's like 20. In Cedar Rapids, there are 3. And Stacy was elected one of the county supervisors at the age of 28. So we call back and forth, and I was talking to him last week and said, hey, Stacy, how you doing? He said, fine, we traded pleasantries, and I was talking about the importance of the profile question. He said, yeah, he said, I have a trip coming up. He lives in Florida now. I have to go from the town I'm in about an hour away. And he said, I'm very concerned. So these are things that people of color think about constantly. I don't get up each day and say, what's going to happen to me because I'm white? I think for most of our friends of color, it's a very, very different situation. So I took away a lot from the first trip to Selma, so I returned. And that right there is Congressman John Lewis, a true hero in my mind. It has been said that Congressman Lewis sat for civil rights. He was involved in Nashville in the sit-ins at the Woolworth lunch counter. I sat at the Woolworth and Kresge lunch counters right here in Dubuque when I was a teenager. Nobody ever hassled me. I could stay as long as I wanted to, and my friends would be there. It's been said he rode for civil rights. He was one of the freedom riders in 1961 through the South that was protesting segregated facilities in the bus depots. And of course, he marched for civil rights many, many times. He was beaten 22 times in his life. He was arrested 44 times in his life. And I thought, how much of that would I take? Sitting at a lunch counter, somebody coming up and in the back of the head, putting a lit cigarette down your back, hassling you time after time. And then in some of those situations, it was the people sitting in who got arrested and dragged off and put in jail. One of my regrets is that this is March 2020, and I had sent email messages to his office in Atlanta and Washington, D.C. I would have hopped on a plane in a moment's notice to go see this guy. and I didn't follow through. And sadly, then he passed 3 months in July after this picture was taken. So one of the lost opportunities, but a true American hero, as far as I'm concerned. So we went back, went through the crossing, or participated in the crossing again, and this time we went to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. If you go to Montgomery, you gotta go here. And we didn't go the first time because it wasn't open. And here's what this place is all about. It documents the over 4,000 lynchings between 1877 and 1950. In lynching, yes, hanging from a tree, many of those. Lynching is taking one's life without due process, and that can happen in any number of ways. I have a couple of examples here. Elias Clayton, because I wanted to show you it wasn't just in the South. That happened in Duluth, Minnesota, in front of a crowd of about 10,000 people. I picked out Jimmy Eastman to show you just kind of the almost unbelievable reason how a man's life could be taken because he refused to be beaten by a white man in a fight. Things that I'd never heard of, hard to believe. One of my dear friends, first guy I met at Augustana College, Tony Clay, played football at Davenport Central. We played down there when I was a junior. They played the fight song after every touchdown. I knew their fight song by halftime. They were pretty good. And Tony became a dear friend. And I said, Tony, I feel bad that I don't know this stuff. And he always called me Davey. He said, Davey, I don't know it either. We had the same books and teachers you guys had. And I'll talk a little bit more about what's been withheld from our kids here in just a moment. Some of these things were advertised in the paper. There were pictures taken and then traded like baseball cards or football cards. Just an amazing phenomenon of which I knew very little or almost nothing. So I saved this one. Elizabeth Lawrence was lynched in Birmingham in 1933, and I'll read parts of this to you. Elizabeth Lawrence, lynched July 5th, 1933 in Jefferson County, Alabama. During this era, African Americans could be lynched for any perceived social transgression, including speaking disrespectfully to a white person, refusing to step off the sidewalk as a white person approached, or using profanity. Remember, we're talking lynching as a result of this. On July 5th, 1933, Elizabeth Lawrence, a school teacher, was walking home in Jefferson County, Alabama, when a group of white school children threw rocks at her. Ms. Lawrence verbally reprimanded the children and continued walking. Now, as a teacher, I can tell you, I have verbally reprimanded students, and sometimes quite sternly, depending on what they were doing that they shouldn't have done. Later that evening, an angry mob went to Ms. Lawrence's home, seized her, burned her house to the ground. She was lynched that night for her perceived social transgression. I thought, how can that be? Elizabeth Lawrence, the school teacher, was home alone. A mob descended on her home. She was shot in the head, and her house was burned to the ground. As I stood before the plaque, I once again thought, and this was a key for me when I started to internalize these kind of things in this way. What if she'd been my wife, sister, mother, grandmother, or daughter? And at that point, it really became clear to me it's not those people, it's our people. And that was a huge transition for me. Interestingly enough, we finally got around to signing an anti-lynching bill, the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill. And I write about Emmett Till, the 14-year-old who went from Chicago to visit his relatives in Mississippi and was brutally murdered and thrown into the Tallahatchie River, all of stuff that is just unbelievable. So it's named after him. In 2022, it was that long. There have been more than 200 previous attempts to pass similar bills over more than a century. Wow. I mean, I just find that staggering. So my writing started to get a little more serious. I started to piece together what could be, parts of the book. And I posted 8 or 9 different postings on Facebook, and the feedback was generally pretty good. A lot of what I encountered when I read and when I went to these places, I didn't know that. Why didn't I know that? I want to know more. Some people said they're going to go to Selma. And so I kept at it. Some of the feedback was interesting. Occasionally, someone would say something like, "Oh, why can't they get over it? That's years ago. We've had a black president." And I would say, I would respond, how you do on Facebook, and I say, I'm working on a book on racism. Can I quote you in the book? And the retort would often be, "I'm not a racist." And I would say, "I didn't say you were. Can I use your quote?" So I don't know if you have to ask permission to use those quotes, and I didn't use them. There were enough other things that I could find, but that's the kind of, I think, unthinking responses in our white privileged society, we really are. Those are things we don't even think about. And our responses can often be to preserve what we're comfortable with rather than what's right. Again, this is me speaking now. You may have different views, and that's okay. So the post became chapters. The profiling chapter, very, very important. And I see Coach Gray Giovanni and his wife sitting out here, and Gray said, "You got to talk to Chandler Collins." And Chandler was a former player for Coach at Augustana College, a good player, and went on to become one of the assistant state attorney generals in Iowa. And I met him and had several conversations, and thanks, Coach, for that. But one of the things that he did, he shared with me, he said, "Dave, my brothers and I came up with something you might be interested in." And it was a takeoff on "you might be redneck if." This was "you might be black if." And they, in a short time, came up with about 25 things that just are very enlightening and give you an idea of what they face on a pretty regular basis. He gave me permission to include that in the book. So it's at least for me, it was a very eye-opening thing. Have you ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin? So, little quiz here. Who's read Uncle Tom's Cabin? Okay. 3 years ago or so, I would have raised my hand because I thought I had. And then I read it, and I knew I had. One of the most incredible books ever written. I had read things about Uncle Tom's Cabin, the tropes, and how Uncle Tom had been changed over time by the white minstrels to make money and all that kind of stuff. And I use that as an example. There's a lot about the book, written in 1851 by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a lady who was about that tall. And sometimes when I was writing and I'd start whining, I think, "Oh man, I can't get this right." Or I'm thinking, this lady's writing in the 1850s, probably with a candle, and a jar of ink and some kind of pen, longhand writing a 400-page book. It was serialized first, and then started to print. It's other than the Bible. The Bible's the only book in the 19th century that sold more books than Uncle Tom's Cabin. It sold 1.5 million copies in London. Now I have to say, my book is an international seller. Now, not international bestseller. There have been 4 copies sold in London. So I'm behind but gaining on Miss Stowe. She was an abolitionist. Her sole mission was to show what was going on in terms of slavery in the South, but in reaction to the fugitive slave law, of which I had not heard, written I think in 1850 or approved in 1850. So if a slave is going north, she lived in Cincinnati, by the way, and along with her father, who was an abolitionist minister, her 5 brothers who were abolitionist ministers. And the key about Cincinnati is that it was right across the Ohio River from Kentucky, which was a slave state. So thinking, if you can get across the Ohio River, you're free. Not so. Even those in the North who fed slaves or clothed them or gave them shelter could be arrested, jailed, and fined. So she was really writing initially against the Fugitive Slave Act. Incredible story. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to do so. I think I'll probably reread it. What Do You Stand For was in reaction to Colin Kaepernick taking a knee and turning the NFL world and beyond upside down. And Anthony Allen, who is president of the NAACP here in Dubuque, helped me really get an understanding. I'm a guy, I say the pledge, I sing the national anthem, not too loudly, out of respect for those around me. But he helped me understand why it is that some people would not. And I think there's some credibility to that. What I hope is that we can get this country to the place where we will all want to do that. We all will want to do that, not because somebody said you had to. And there's some pretty good history in there about why flags got in schools and the pledge itself and so on. So I encourage you to take a look at that. What's in a name? I went to Marshall Elementary School. People in the room here in Dubuque, out on the north end. And it could have been named for Marshall Dillon, for all I know. Some of the older people in the crowd know who Marshall Dillon is. If you're younger, have your dad or somebody tell you. But I went in and out of that school. We had no lunch, so we walked home for lunch. So I don't know, do the math, but 7 years times 180 school days times 4 times a day walking past there. Thousands of times I walked past that name. No idea who it was named for. So when I was working on this chapter, I thought, I better take a look close to home and not just jump all over the people in the South. So it was named for John C. Marshall. He's the longest serving Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice in the history of the United States. And I'm thinking, wow, I would just go name for that guy. He also owned about 300 slaves during his life and wrote opinions that favored slavery in the country. So I'm not going to march into the Dubuque Board of Education meeting and say, let's change the name of Marshall School. But I do believe that at Marshall School and other schools and other places where we have names emblazoned above the entryways, we should at least know for whom they're named. And that's the point I try to make in What's in a Name. Guess who's coming to dinner? Talk about 4 different personalities in that chapter. And the very first one is a young man from Clinton, Iowa. I'm in 8th grade. And I have seen this guy run the hurdles and play basketball and play football. He went on to Drake University, where he was a starting defensive back, young black man. And my oldest brother brought him home to dinner on Thanksgiving Eve when I was in 8th grade. The first, and probably, as far as I know, the only black person who ever came into our house in Dubuque. And this is hard for me to do, but as I recall, I just sat across the table and listened. And that was the first entry into seeing someone that wasn't someone that I thought about with Amos and Andy and the tropes and the memes and all those things. So a seed was planted, and I'd like to tell you that everything changed overnight, and I was a different person, but that first seed was planted there. And then there's some other individuals, including Jesse Owens, in that chapter. And I had the opportunity to meet Jesse Owens just a year later. And I had seen movies of him, the old black and whites. And Jesse Owens from the Ohio State University, a terrific athlete. Big Ten championships in 1935, held at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. In 45 minutes, Jesse Owens set 4 world records. Sports Illustrated calls it the best 45 minutes in sports history. What do you think, Coach? I think maybe that might be accurate. So off Jesse goes then to the 1936 Olympics, held in where? Berlin. And think of what was going on in Berlin. He wins 4 gold medals there, comes home. He and his wife are invited to one of the big hotels in New York City to be feted, to be honored, to be recognized. He and his wife had to take the freight elevator in the back of the hotel up to the dining room. So these are some of the folks that I've talked about, and guess who's coming to dinner. How does America hand out its life chances? I'm an educator. I believe in education. I think many of us in this room have been able to do things because of the education we got. Is it handed out equally? Does everybody get an equal shot? Dig into those kinds of things, including the 1954 and 1955 Brown versus the Board of Education decisions. And there's more to that than meets the eye. There may be a book, too, that gets into what's the other side of Brown. Do teachers make a difference? They certainly have in my life. And I talk about Nicole Hannah-Jones, who put together the 1619 Project. Nicole Hannah-Jones from West Waterloo, or went to West Waterloo High School. She actually lived in East Waterloo. And the impression and the impact that her teacher had on her that got her thinking beyond what was in Waterloo at the time. Do Black lives really matter? Tell some stories that when I heard them, got me scratching my head. And as we look at what goes on around us today, it's easy to say those things. We've got to do some things to make sure that we follow through. There's a lot of really tough stuff in the book. It was hard for me to read it. It was difficult to write about it. I thought I should and share it. The longest chapter in the book is there hope. And so why do I have hope? Guys like this. Jeremiah Chapman, at the time, was a junior at Charles City High School. Played center field. And they were at a game at Waverly Shell Rock on the road, so he goes out to take his position in center field. And some of the adults behind the fence in center field are saying things like, go back to the field. Well, this was about a month after George Floyd was murdered. They're saying, you should have been George Floyd. This is a 17-year-old kid. I played center field for the Rams when I was 17. I don't know what I would have done if anyone said something like that to me. Just incredible. So why do I bring that up? Well, good news, in 2021, he was given the All-Iowa Courage Award, which is a huge thing. So about 3 weeks ago, I wondered, how's Jeremiah doing? So I went back to the Charles City paper, looked up an article about him, found the name of the reporter, and then got in contact with the reporter. I said, how's Jeremiah doing? The next thing I know, I get an email message from his mother, and she gives me his phone number. So I called him. I said, how are you doing? He said, I'm doing okay. He said, I'm a teacher aide right now. He said, Kim, I want to be a teacher. That warms my heart, right? Teachers in the audience, and he will be. This kid is something to behold. That gives me hope. Here's another thing that gives me hope. If you look at that picture, this is Washington Elementary. Actually, it's a K-8 building, and it's just south of Chicago, in Riverdale, Illinois. If you look at that, you may see someone in the front row who looks something like the guy standing up here. So that's my son.
Which one?
Good.
That's a joke.
We needed,
That's a joke.
I needed that one.
That's a joke.
Yeah, so anyway, he's now in his 4th year as principal of that school. He's been in the district for 15 years. Came up, all white family. In fact, all of his schooling was in Geneseo, Illinois, a town of about 6,500. I think there was one black student at the high school when Josh, my son, was there. And so good things can happen. We can talk about things. We can aspire to do things. And the school pretty much reflects the faculty. There's about 90% of the kids there are African American, and about 95% of them are on free and reduced. What's interesting, he sent me a picture of a 6th grade class. They're taken in the 1960s, and the teacher and all of the students are white. So this is an area that has undergone some pretty significant changes. So yeah, I think there's hope. I was asked to speak at Episcopal Church in Cedar Rapids a few weeks ago, and that's the sign I saw. I like that. So when I went in there, I said, "You got a nice sign out there. Do you really believe it?" And through my interactions, I can't say everyone did, but I got the feeling that yeah, they're walking the talk. The book is part memoir, part case study, history, heavily researched. And hit the wrong button there. One of the last things we did when we were in Montgomery after we marched across the Pettus Bridge, we went to the Legacy Museum. It's a history of enslavement in this country. It's an amazing display. There's sound, there's video, there's still photographs and explanations, and you walk on somewhat of a trail that takes you from 1619, when those first enslaved people arrived on our shores, to present times. When we got done, we went out in the car and just sat there for about a half hour. Could not say much. I mean, it was that moving. Then I looked up and I saw this, the old teacher. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, may not be lived again. And it's such a fundamental statement that we really have a hard time living up to, it seems to me, in this country. So I believe we learn from history by uncovering our past, not covering it up. And I was in Barnes & Noble a while back, and I looked at the table. They had a table, there was a sign on it that said banned books. I looked at those titles and I read some of those books. They're really good books. And so a little while later, someone said, "Do you think your book will be banned?" I said, "I hope so." I'd like to throw that on a back pocket, Just a few words about book bans. What's best and wisest, what the best and wisest parent wants for his own child, that must the community want for all of its children. And I really think that's key for all of us. When people are being held down, all of us are down there in some way or another. So if we can raise people up together, I think the benefits could be tremendous. You may recognize this as part of Gettysburg Address, Lincoln's famous 2-minute speech. The guy that went before him spoke for 2 hours, and Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes. And the guy went up to him and said, "You said in 2 minutes what I tried to say in 4 hours or 2 hours." And Lincoln said, afterwards said, he had no idea that this would be one of the most memorable speeches of all time. And that was given on November 19th, 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg was July 1, 2, 3, 1863. So I'm thinking, it's kind of a delay. Gettysburg is a town of was about 2,500 people. The fighting took place in July. There were over 7,000 deaths in this 3-day battle, one of the bloodiest periods of warfare ever. And the townspeople were pretty much responsible for taking care of the dead. So it took them quite a while to be able to, bury the bodies and give them a proper service and all those kinds of things. So I can hear Lincoln asking us, how are we doing? Take a look around. This room, are we reflective of our society today? Your neighborhood? Your church? Some people say churches are the most segregated places on Sunday mornings in the country. There are some efforts in Cedar Rapids, in Des Moines, and probably other places too, where congregations pastors are starting to integrate. A black pastor, a white pastor are starting to bring their congregations. And I've been able to be to a couple of those services, and they're amazing. Your social club. If you have a business, what's the web page look like? In Cedar Rapids, we get what's called Parade of Homes. I don't know if you have that in Dubuque, but it's a supplement that comes out. And each year I go through and look at all the pictures. And usually there's about 40 pictures. And I'm looking at how do they portray the bankers? How do they portray the realtors? How do they portray the builders? And it's kind of interesting. So when you see advertising, at least to me, it's interesting to look at. How about your town? This town looks a lot different than when I was here, graduating in 1967. And what do you see? In my life, small things have made a difference. Go out and make a friend with someone who doesn't look like you and find the sunshine in that relationship. That's a quote from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Pretty good basketball player back in the day. Turns out a great humanitarian. And I can just say, it might change your world. It has to. Okay, how about some questions? We'll go here and then there. Got one right here. Yeah.
Governors and departments of ed are trying to control how history is taught. We need to teach our history. But the definition that they have of their history does not include the racial problems. So you had a quote from Maya Angelou that we need to do that. How in the world can we avoid the trend to step backwards in letting our young people know the truth about what happened on this continent?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and nowhere is it more important than right here in the state of Iowa, which for those of us who've been around for a while, it's really disappointing. The first integration of a public school in the country was in 1848, I think, in Muscatine, Iowa. And we have a state that when there have been need to take in people from other countries, we've been very accommodating. We're not seeing those things today. And I'm kind of dancing around this. The direct answer is, and just so you know, I have voted for Republicans, I have voted for Democrats. I'm not a straight ticket guy. But it seems to me we're going to have to get people in decision-making positions that can turn these things around. To think that studying someone else, including them in the history of our country, if that makes some people uncomfortable, what about just avoiding the whole thing? What's fair about that? So without knowing how everyone feels in the room, I just want you to know, I think it's a travesty. I think we should be able to teach all of history. There's been some criticism of the 1619 Project, the book in the curriculum materials and stuff. Let's debate them. Let's bring them in. That's one of the things we do in public education. There aren't too many books that I've read that I said, I'm not sure about that. but that doesn't mean we should throw it aside. And if you tell someone you can't do something, I don't know. That's why I said I hope they hand my book. Don't read that. Human nature says, you know, I kind of want to take a look at that, right? But it's really handcuffing our teachers. Really difficult to do a job when you're looking over your shoulder all the time. You know, it's a tough enough job anyway, but I'm with you in spirit. We got to figure out how to, you know, become a free and open society again, because it seems we're going in a different direction. Again, that's an opinion that I have, and be happy to listen to other opinions as well. So thanks for the question. Yes, in the back.
Oh, well, first I want to say, what a great presentation. Your
Thank you.
career as a teacher definitely shows. And I apologize for coming in late, but you had mentioned that one of your top things was interviews. So I was curious, hopefully I didn't miss this before I came in, but if I did, you can just tell me to sit down. But what was obviously you must have done a lot of interviews. I was wondering, what was your whole idea of doing interviews? How do you prepare for it? And I was just kind of curious.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. And I did 35 interviews, 35 different people, most of them multiple interviews, and some of them then turned into not interviews, but I'd call someone that, you know, I'd say, Anthony Allen, I've got a question about this, or, you know, the people that I knew. So early on, you know, I went out with my legal pad and took notes, and I found out that I'm not the greatest note taker. So I would go back to the people, because I want to make sure it was accurate, you know, particularly when you're quoting people, you want to make sure you're accurate. So I would go back, and some folks would, you know, generously and correct me, and that was fine, because then, you know, I wanted to do that. So then when the pandemic broke out, I went to Zoom and started recording Zoom sessions, and that really helped because I could capture that. So when the pandemic ended, one of the first interviews I did was Stacy Walker, who I referenced earlier, the county supervisor. So I went in, and I hadn't seen him in years, you know, and we went in, Mr. Walker, how are you? You know, we have all these formalities. And I said, you know, you probably remember me as, you know, the guy that gave the 4-minute spellbinding speech at your graduation. He said, no. He said, I remember you as the guy who could have called more snow days. So, you know, and by the way, you know, a lot of serious stuff, but we, among all of us, you know, we've had many lighthearted moments. So I'm in there with Stacy, and this is another guy. Think of you're sitting across the table from Barack Obama. I mean, that's the way Stacy presents himself. He is just really all put together. So I take my phone out, and I, you know, to record, put it there, and we go for about an hour and a half. I get out to the car, and I can't wait to listen to it, because this guy just knocked it out of the park, you know. TED Talks right there. I didn't hit the record button. So I took out my legal pad and wrote everything. First I downshifted and was numb for about 10 minutes. And then I took out my legal pad and started writing as fast as I could. And when I got home, I called him and I said, hey, Stacey, and he's, you know, very gracious. He says, you know, we'll do it again. We had several interviews after that. But that's generally how we did it with Zooms. And then sometimes if I wanted to zero in on just a specific thing, you know, we could do those smaller talks that way. But that's how I went about it.
So you're telling us how not to do interviews.
Yes, yeah. You know, there are exemplars and non-exemplars, and I've filled the role both ways at times. Yes?
I read the book, and it obviously did not put Dubuque in a real positive light in a lot of ways. And of course, a lot of those that are history and cannot be undone. But one of the things that stuck with me was your story about the naming of Marshall School. So you said when you found that out, you did not march to the school board and demand anything. Did you ever talk to the school board or approach them?
No, I haven't. And
well, I did.
okay.
So I didn't march to them, but I did email all of the board members and the superintendent after I read the book, and I put it in the light of, I just read this book, you know, it was disturbing in these ways, and in light of, the taking down of statues and the renaming of so many buildings, because of this going on lately, has the school board ever considered this? Well, first of all, I was very disappointed that I did not hear back from one single board member, not one. And about a month later, I got an email from the superintendent, about a month later. And basically, it was a very also disappointing, generic, as you can imagine, the naming of buildings is a complex process that includes a weaving of both historical and current context. Should the district decide to explore the, blah, blah, blah. So I guess I'm really not sure what my question is. It's more, if that is something that can be changed, at what point do we still try to change that? Is that something that we should let the public know about, or is that just oh, well, no big deal, I tried and didn't get anywhere?
Yeah, having been on the other side of that in a school administrative position when people would bring us various ideas, I don't think you ever want to be dismissive, and I'm not in their shoes. I'm just telling you, did not want to be dismissive. I would invite people in to talk about issues, and I never believed I had the best idea all the time, because I didn't, and I usually learn from others. So I would encourage further exploration if that be the case. And I just want to respond to a little bit about, if you read the book, there's a lot of factual stuff about Dubuque in years gone by. That's the way it was. And I don't believe you get better by, if you're making mistakes, you just cover them up and say they never happened. You learn by your mistakes. Later in the book, I come back and talk about Dubuque today. And I think it was, again, you can decide, but I thought it was quite positive. And one of the things that I said in there, because the three main cities where I had the interviews and so on, Rock Island, Cedar Rapids, and Dubuque. Both Rock Island and Cedar Rapids are much more diverse population-wise than Dubuque. And Dubuque is a small number, but Dubuque has a higher percentage of law enforcement officers of color. So I don't know, I'm just saying I found that interesting. I don't know what I expected, but that wasn't what I was expecting. So would you go back at it again? If you're passionate about it and you think it has not been given a fair review, it never hurts to come back. I know people have come to me more than once, and you consider it. So I hope that answers the question, and we'll see where it goes. Yes?
Well, I haven't read the book, but from your presentation, you currently have covered the who, what, where, and when. Are you going to write a book on the why?
Yeah, one of the things I can tell you, there's more that didn't get in the book that did get in the book. And if I'm around long enough, I would like to have another swipe at it. And it's fairly narrow. When you talk about racism, certainly black-white racism is not the only racism in this country. I had to narrow the scope to be able to have a thread that didn't result in something that went all over the place. So the why, we're still looking at that. And I just completed reading White Poverty. The name of the author escapes me right now. Take a look at that. Talks about approaching things in a fusion manner. One of the things overlooked in our society is extreme white poverty. And the powers that be have pitted poor whites and poor black folks against each other for their own benefit, for the upper echelon's economic benefit. So I think there's certainly more to be told, for sure. And I would point out that this gentleman in the back that just asked the question handed me this when he came in, and he was at Selma in 1965.
Last 2 days of March.
Yeah, but still there when Dr. King came, and there was Bloody Sunday was the first one, Turnaround Tuesday, because they came across the bridge and went back, and then they got federal support the National Guard was federalized, and they got to Selma on the third attempt. But this gentleman was there in 1965. Yes.
I'm thinking about the book Schindler's List, where he had the courage to stand up to racism when it was really dangerous. What about a book? Have you read a book about white people who did the right thing and stood up to racism when it wasn't cool?
Yeah, and there are examples of that. This gentleman would be, and I was out in Des Moines at a book event. There were two gentlemen from the University of Illinois that went down to Selma. The Freedom Rides. So there has been involvement of white folks, not in everything, but in some along the way. And what courage that would take too.
It'd be a way to speak to people who say, you know, we should be teaching these things about, you know, this would praise white people, which may help get conservative people on board. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, what we've done to this point, and I see a familiar face in the back, what we've done to this point is it working? So, you know, if it's not working, you gotta kind of step back and say, should we try something a little bit different? But I just think that we've been so divided, and now with social media and so on, those divisions seem, maybe they're just clearer, but they seem so strong and tough to overcome. Yes?
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So I just want to explain, I am Bill Campbell, and I'm creating a documentary on Black lives in the neighborhoods you within almost 40 years. I'm documenting that. And I'm saying that, and I'm asking you this question. When you were doing the interviews, do you find it that some people were put off and wanted nothing to do with you, and wouldn't do an interview, or were kind of like hands in the face, or was everyone quite receptive?
I would say very receptive for the most part. There were, I can recall one person who I thought was copping out, frankly, that made up something that wasn't quite accurate about what I was intending to do or something like that. There were some people that just didn't respond, you know, that I invited and there was no response. So it wasn't certainly 100%. I was heartened by those that participated, and some of them I didn't know prior to our contact. So, you know, I was very fortunate. Started with people I knew, so that's always an easier route, I think, than those you know. And then went from with recommendations from the people I knew into the next group. So, good question, and good luck with your project. Yes.
I think you said your chapter on hope was quite lengthy, which sounds wonderful that it is. And could you share just one thought from that chapter?
Could you just repeat her question?
Okay, yeah, good question. So the hope is the longest chapter in the book. The kind lady asked me to repeat just one idea or thought that supports that. And the reason I'm pausing, because there are several in there. But undeniably the greatest one is the spirit of the people that have been at this for a while, that it's been my pleasure to interview, that came in some cases from very dire straits and stayed at it, and stayed at it. And I said earlier, you know, would I have stayed at it? And they have gotten themselves and their children to a better place. Now, as soon as, and I say that, but the realism is they continue to feel like they're banging their heads against the wall at times as well. So the spirit of the people who have stayed with it, I think, provides hope. The chapter has several examples of historical figures that probably I didn't know anything about, who have done great things in mathematics and other fields, you know, so that provides hope. I do believe there's a lot of hope, but someone once said hope is not a strategy, right? You can't say, I hope we're going to win tonight. You've got to have a strategy, and I think that's where the weak link right now, there does not appear to be a coordinated strategy that is going to go out, we can put in the game and is going to get us where we want to do, or where we want to be. So thank you for that question. Yes?
Are blacks racist, some of them toward whites?
Yeah, the question essentially, are some black people holding racist views toward whites? And here's what I would say. And I'll use the thought that comes to mind. I think it was 1985 or 86. The movie Gettysburg came out. It was, I believe, made for TV. And Jeff Daniels played a character. His name was Colonel Chamberlain. He had gone to Bowdoin College in Maine, signed up for the Union soldiers, as a Union officer. There was a lull in the fighting at Gettysburg, and he's sitting on the side of the hill with his first sergeant, who was an Irishman, at least according to the way he spoke in his appearance. Look at me profile. I think he was that. And they were talking, and Chamberlain, Colonel Chamberlain says, First Sergeant, what do you make of this whole thing? They talk about what they're fighting for, enslavement, and the sergeant said, anyone who would judge a man by the group is a peewit. So we are all individuals. As members of a church or a school or this or that, we share commonalities, but we all are individuals. So are there white races? Certainly. Are there black races? Certainly. Right? No race has, claim to anything, good or bad, as a group. We are all here as individuals, and what we do as individuals is what we should be held accountable for, seems to me. Now, when we see things that are wrong in our opinion, we should, work to eradicate those kinds of things. So, yeah, in our society, I don't think a member of any race is immune from anything. It's an individual thing within a group of people. So, really good question. Other things. Have we reached that point? Just so you know, I have some books that I will sign. There's more in the bag if we need them. The profits from tonight's book sales will go to Dubuque Community Schools. They were good to me when I was here as a kid, so that those profits will go back. I'll just be there. Venmo, my kids taught me how to do that. PayPal, cash and checks if you're interested. So thank you very much.